Hello and welcome. My name is Shannon Kemp and I'm the Executive Editor for Data Diversity. We would like to thank you for joining today's Data Diversity webinar, Metadata Strategies, the latest installment in a monthly series called Data Ed Online with Dr. Peter Aiken, brought to you in partnership with Data Blueprint. Now let me give the floor to Brett, the webinar organizer from Data Blueprint, the new one. Congratulations and welcome, Brett, to introduce today's speaker and today's webinar topic. Hello and welcome.
Thanks, Shannon. Hello, everyone, and welcome. Thank you for finding the time in your busy schedules to join us for today's webinar, Metadata Strategies. As always, a big thank you goes out to Shannon and Data Diversity for hosting us. We will get started in just a few moments after I let you know about some housekeeping items and introduce your presenter. We have a 1-hour presentation followed by 30 minutes of Q&A, and we'll try to answer as many questions as time allows, but feel free to submit questions as they come up throughout the session. To answer the top 2 most commonly asked questions, yes, you will receive an email with links to download today's materials and the webinar recording so you can view it afterwards. These materials will be sent out within the next 2 business days. You can find us on Twitter, Facebook, and LinkedIn. We've set up the hashtag DataEd on Twitter, so if you're logged in, feel free to use it in your tweets and submit your questions and comments that way. We will keep an eye on the Twitter feed and will include answers to these questions in our post-session email. Now, let me introduce you to our presenter. Peter Aiken is an internationally recognized data management thought leader. Many of you already know him or have seen him at conferences worldwide. He has more than 30 years of experience and has received many awards for his outstanding contributions to the profession. Peter is also the founding director of Data Blueprint. He has written dozens of articles and 8 books. The most recent is Monetizing Data Management. Peter is experienced with more than 500 data management practices in 20 countries and consistently named as a top data management expert. Some of the most important and largest organizations in the world have sought out his and Data Blueprint's expertise. Peter has spent multi-year immersions with groups as diverse as the U.S. Department of Defense, Deutsche Bank, Nokia, Wells Fargo, the Commonwealth of Virginia, and Walmart. He often appears at conferences and is constantly traveling. Peter, where are you today?
On our way to Boston for a thing. Anyway, welcome everybody. Britt, it's wonderful to have you join us on this monthly occurrence that we do. Our topic today is metadata management strategies. And as we get started, I'm going to put up a quote that my friend and colleague Dave Eddy sent us a little while back. Dave has been researching this area for almost as long as I've been alive on this, and he's a wonderful person to talk to about these topics, but he's really got some conclusions here. He's talking here about data dictionaries, but data dictionary is part of, and in fact usually for most organizations, the first, an easiest step to getting started with metadata. And yet when he looks out at how things have gone from the years 1973 to 2003, he sees what's called about a 5% survival rate, which means that 95% of the efforts that get started in this area have died within that 20-year period. And again, his conclusion here is that metadata has morphed into a meaningless buzzword, which is, of course, unfortunate. What we're going to do today is to actually dive in, sort of tease apart that and show why it's hard and give you all some guidance as to how you can get these efforts to be sustainable. So we'll start out with our standard data management practices overview, and then we'll dive in and say what is metadata and why is it important. And it turns out the answer to that is kind of interesting. We'll look at major metadata types and subject areas, look at specific benefits, applications, and sources, talk about a strategic approach in order to implement these. What are the building blocks that you need to have in place in order to have good metadata practices, and some guiding principles. And I'll finish up with something that has proven rather popular over the past couple of years, which is that people have said to me, give me something that I can show to literally anybody and they will understand the value of metadata. So I've got a very nice teachable example using iTunes in this case. Most people are familiar with iTunes, so it actually is kind of relevant on that. So let's jump in and take a look. First of all, what we mean by data management, and most people say that's the thing that you do between getting data and using it. Those are the two important events that occur in a piece of data's life, coming into existence and then being applied in some context. And we add into this sort of some data engineering concepts, some data storage concepts, some data delivery, some governance around that process, which means we now need to talk about having some specific team skills. And when we look at that, even this description of what we've been doing is not really very suitable, and this is one I wrote myself back in 2007, because it doesn't well depict the real primary concept of gathering data, which is to reuse it. So I've put a big red reuse on the other end of that. Even that's not really a great way of depicting it. So we've now moved our data management concept to, yes, we need the engineering, we need the storage, we need the delivery, but you'll notice now that data is being stored as a resource. And that the more we store and use of it, the more we can apply it to the various workflow streams that we have, the better off we will be. We still need those team skills, and now we draw a line around the whole thing and call it data governance. And within that context, what we're really doing, in order to do it well, we have to manage the metadata. So let's see what that means in terms of actually managing things. We've now broken data management down into 5 practice areas. This is thanks to our folks at the friends at the CMMI Institute. We're saying that data can be managed coherently. Typically, data is managed really well at the workgroup level, and the point of inspiration for your various organizations is to say, hey, if we're doing it well at the workgroup level, what would happen if all those workgroups were working on strategy, working towards some sort of strategic implementation of data as an asset? Similarly, we can now talk about the ability to manage data professionally and unprofessionally. We've gotten that mature. We now talk about making data that is fit for purpose and having the right architecture and the right lifecycle components along with the relevant supporting practices that are in there. This is what we mean by data management practice areas. I showed you the functional diagram on the previous slide, and now I'm going to show you Maslow's hierarchy of needs, which most people just sort of go, oh, wait a minute, where are you going with this? Well, Maslow, many people remember from high school, had a very good theory that said if your food, clothing, and shelter needs are unmet, it's very unlikely that you're going to go home and self-actualize. Another word that we use for it in today's parlance is flow. You get into a flow state. Data is like that. We've got all these great things in the golden triangle that we want to have, and they're great, but they really do just represent the absolute tip of the iceberg. And if you're familiar with this picture, you know that that iceberg extends way beyond the dimensions of your screen here, and it's really true in data management as well. These advanced practices can only work well organizationally if we provide a decent foundation for them, and that foundation, most importantly, is governed by the area that I showed you in the previous slide, the DMM areas, and those DMM areas only function as well as the weakest link. So in this diagram, it means that this organization should put more efforts into their data platform and their data architecture before trying to enhance their governance, their quality, their strategy, or their operations. Otherwise, they're just simply wasting money. The golden triangle really is a focus on technology, and that's a good focus, and we need to have it. But we also need that technological focus to be paired with capabilities of the organization and improve the organization's ability to, in fact, employ the technologies around the organization and across the various lines of business that they're trying to do. Now, we get asked a lot of times at Data Blueprint, okay, but today's Tuesday, and I need to have this stuff done by Friday. Can we do it faster? And the answer is yes, you can, but it'll take longer, cost more, deliver less, and present greater risk to the organization than if instead you put those capabilities in place before buying into a whole series of technologies. Now, continuing on with our data management foundation, many of you are familiar with the DMBOK. This is something we're very proud at in data management and in DAMA in particular, to say that we can now talk about what it means to do data management within here. And metadata management, notice, is in the upper left-hand side here. I've outlined it in red. The idea is, of course, that if you start to get good at these areas, our CDMP will now be worked on within those areas, and we will join the 2,500 other professionals that have now been put into play working in this area. Our DIMBOK talks about metadata management from an IPO perspective, and the only reason I'm showing you this here, we're not going to walk through the diagram, but is to see that it is a very definitive part of metadata management. So let's dive in and see what it is and why it's important. First of all, this is titled Metadata Strategy, so we need to understand what the definition of strategy is as well. The use of the term strategy is relatively new. Before 1950, nobody really used it outside of the military domain. But now what it really means is a pattern in a stream of decisions, and that's a really good way to hold it, because what we're saying is we want to do some things that will eventually result in a specific set of outcomes for the organization. Now, as I mentioned before, there's a little bit of history around the term. People don't know whether to call it metadata, meta-data, or metadata. And the answer to this is pretty good. In the past, when we pasted them together to form a concept, we put a hyphen in them. But over time, that hyphen gets lost. And we absolutely are making the argument now that that time has passed, that people should be talking about metadata rather than meta-space data or meta-data. It just introduces confusion. There was a copyright on the term metadata, but they didn't really have much luck enforcing the fact that they had it, any more so than Microsoft would if they patented all the zeros and the ones that are out there. So let's talk about metadata. Now, what is metadata? Well, first of all, it's everywhere. It's integral to all IT systems. Metadata is to data what data is to real life. Data reflects these real-life transaction events, and metadata reflects data transactions around those same kind of events. Our colleague David Hay has a very good definition: the data that describe the structure and workings of an organization's use of information, which describe the systems it use to manage that information. Great quote, absolutely meaningful. Gartner provided us a definition as well: data describing various facets of a data asset. All of these things are helpful. The most recent Gartner definition is the one I like. Metadata unlocks the value of data and therefore requires management attention. That second clause, of course, is the key. If you're going to unlock and provide a value proposition, which the other definitions allude to but sort of imply, what we really want to say is, anything having to do with value, management should be concerned with. Therefore, metadata management is the set of processes that allow us to support metadata practices in the organization. Now, most of you on the call sort of may have heard of these things. These are called Kargh Catalogs. I'm joking. Some of us, of course, use these and grew up on them, but the kids, what are those things? Well, this is the metadata that we use to keep information about a library in. It identifies what books are in the library, where they're located, allows us to search by subject area, by author, by title. The catalog shows us same types of information here and where in the library these books reside. It determines which books are going to meet the user's requirements. Without the catalog, finding things in a library would be extremely time-consuming and difficult. So metadata provides this equivalent function, Kargh Catalog, in the data area. These are tags. You'll usually see them associated with, social media type things where we're doing tagging and things like that. It tells business users where to find the information and, more importantly, which information they are using as they're going through the process of whatever their daily jobs are. Again, the details, it can provide provenance information, where it came from. It can provide quality information, and really unlocking the value of data. Now, our colleague Brad Melton put together a real nice definition. He said, look, it's any combination of the thing in the circle, which is a data, and anything on the outside of it. So any combination of who, what, where, when, why, or how unlocks the value of whatever is in the middle. Again, if we go back to our library example here, libraries operate efficiently through the metadata Kargh catalog. So the library book sits at the center, but the who is the author, the what is the title, where is the shelf location, when is the publication date. If the book was published in the last century, it may not be relevant to the Internet of Things topic that I'm looking for right now. A very small amount of metadata, the Kargh catalog, unlocks tremendous amounts of value. The library. And if you've ever tried to use one without it, good luck, right? Another very obvious example to illustrate metadata is our email programs. Regardless of which one you use, you have what, which is the subject area, how, which is a priority type thing. Some messages are important, some are not. Where is it? It's in your inbox or it's in your personal. Why? What's the body of the message? When? Sent and received. We use these tools to help filter out and weed out stuff. You want the stuff from your boss to go right to the top so you pay attention to it, and the stuff that says free catalogs or kitten videos to be at the bottom for when you're doing something else. Imagine trying to manage all of the things in your inbox without the ability to do searching and filtering based on the metadata. So hopefully you've got an idea of what metadata is. Now let's dive in a little bit further. There are various types of metadata that you can look at. You may be looking at a process architecture in your organizations. Although only 1 in 10 organizations actually does have process architectures that are maintained, they still are a fairly let's just call it a best practice that's out there. So the data that describes how this process functions is also in and of itself metadata. In fact, you could talk about the data stores that are involved, any governance or regulation that may come into play, who the process owner might be or a stakeholder. Again, what types of process dependencies or decompositions these processes are a part of. It's typically not in standalone mode. Feedback loops, documentation, even the name of the process can describe this sort of thing. And in fact, whether or not the process map exists is itself a use of metadata. So who created the documentation? Are there dependencies? How do these business processes interact with each other when we're looking at them from an architectural perspective? We also can talk about business metadata. In fact, there's a number of different metadata types that we can talk about. I'm using this to illustrate that it really is pervasive. So the business names, the definitions of the subject, the concept areas, the entities, attributes, and elements, the data types, other attribute properties, ranges, calculations. There was one organization I know that had to restate their earnings at one point in time because somebody grabbed the wrong code section and actually presented their earnings to Wall Street incorrectly. Most people would think that individual would be fired. This organization not only didn't fire the individual, but decided to learn some lessons about metadata management as a result of that particular exercise. I thought that was a really, really nice story, being able to describe their learning experiences that way as a metadata learning experience. We also have technical, operational metadata. Again, technical metadata might include something like the physical table data names, okay? It's stored in a database file called, student information. And there's a column name called Sam. You say, well, why did you call it Sam? And so, well, that was the initials of the guy who put the column there. Probably not good metadata, but it's still valid metadata on that. Operational metadata, again, allows us to understand job scheduling information or things like that. For example, auditing controls, balance information. Lewis and I did a presentation a couple of weeks back where we were talking to the internal auditing groups for, it was a professional organization of internal auditing groups, and they were very interested in all of these topics. Again, archiving rules, retention rules, the legal people are going to be very concerned with these. Again, just different types of extracts and things like that. We may have data stewardship metadata, where the stewardship, who is responsible for it, what sort of responsibilities that they have, making sure that they understand that all of this information is accurate and, in this case, focused on quality. They may look at monitoring and data sharing types of operations. Again, business drivers, goals, data with Crud rules. I'll come back to that in just a second. Data definitions, owners, data sharing rules, data stewardship roles and responsibilities. Whose job is that? How am I supposed to take care of it? I'm going to spend a minute on the Crud rules for just a minute. Sounds like I'm saying a bad word, but those of you that recognize Crud is an acronym for create, read, update, and delete. And a Crud matrix is a very important piece of metadata that is often used in our data operations, where we're talking about which pieces of data are used by which processes and which processes produce which other pieces of data. A Crud matrix really is the embellishment. It's the essence of what's actually happening between the process and the data worlds in there. Another type of metadata, provenance. Again, where it comes from, what is the source of it. For each datum in this, it says where did it come from, but we made derivations of it, when was it created, what types of programs might have done it, who's the process owner, what's the steward responsibility for it, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. I want to tell a quick story on this one, which is that we had one company that we were called in to work for at one point in time, and interestingly, oftentimes we'll come in through IT or through the business. This time we came in through the CFO, who had an interesting challenge. His company was being broken up and sold, part to a company in Europe and part was going to stay in the U.S. And he said, my problem is this, Peter. Every day somebody comes into me with a report, and this report proves why I should sell somebody else's part of the company and keep their part here, because most people didn't want to move to Europe. Not that they were anti-European or anything, just people don't like change. So I have no way of knowing where they're getting their data from, and consequently I don't know anything about the quality of the data that's in their reports, and I, as a CFO, can't make decisions. So we helped him out and built a little portal where we said, right now all of the data in your organization is of unknown provenance. We don't know where it's from. If you want to use data that is important for the decision, show us where you're coming up with the data. What is your source? Where is it coming from? And then put it within this. This was a branding exercise. And we put the data within this one portal, and from that one portal, if we used information from that portal, we knew where that data came from. It had known provenance. And we could look specifically and say, yes, that data is of good quality for making these types of decisions, so then you can use this type of information as we go forward here. I'm giving you, again, a couple of different things here about metadata types. Right? You can use it for analytics, business architecture, definitions, rules, governance, integration, quality, document content management, information technology, infrastructure, conceptual data models, logical data models. All of these are concerned with metadata. In fact, we can back up a little bit and say that of these two sets of lists here, the language of data governance must in fact be metadata in order for it to actually be worthwhile. If you're not talking about specific metadata, if you just say, I want to clean up the data around the customers, that's not specific enough to be actionable. So what we want to do is to say, from a metadata perspective, we want to make sure that we clean up the customer data that is in this particular data set here in order to enhance the customer experience, and that we want to use the data from that customer data set that has been cleaned up in order to actually improve the customer relationships that we have out there with everybody. So these are 16 areas that just, again, talk about different types of metadata, subject areas, et cetera, et cetera. Let's move on a little further. Metadata benefits. If we understand where the data is coming from, then we can start to show how it unlocks the value of information. If I just toss out the number 42, as I do at many of my presentations, some of you chuckle and say, yes, he's making a reference to The Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. On the other hand, if I say, no, I'm talking about the year I was born, many of you would look at me and say, he's lying, which is clearly the case. I was not born in 42. But again, this is metadata around this, so this value is absolutely crucial. It also means if you have better metadata management, you will reduce your training costs, because there is documentation. One of the jokes I make at a lot of my talks is, why can't NASA get back to the moon? And the true answer is because they didn't do the documentation. That documentation is, in fact, metadata. Again, it's unlocking the value of the data that's around us, in this case, telling NASA how to get back to the moon. We can also speed up research analysis time. So this gets to our wonderful data science friends that we talk about an awful lot. Many times what you'll see is that they spend a lot of time, in fact 80% of their time, munging the data. The comments that are made around this, again, are 60 or 80% of your time is spent munging the data and 20% analyzing it, which means in very practical terms, if you give a data scientist a project on Monday, they won't start to actually figure out anything useful from it until Friday. and that's not a very good piece. We can speed that up tremendously by better metadata management practices around there. Getting on the same sheet of paper, improving the communication between business users and IT professionals, and making sure that we stay on the same piece of paper. It's pretty easy to come up with an initial specification that makes sense to everybody, but when we want to make sure that our perspectives on that evolve over time, we also have to make sure that we stay on that same sheet of paper so that everybody understands this in a going forward type of sense. Time to market. Again, reducing the amount of time that you spend in systems development, lifecycle activities. And one of the other talks I give, I talk about a chemical engineering company that we've worked with on and off for years who had us speed up their research groups because the research groups were terrific at doing chemical engineering research, but really, really not expert at doing data management. And we helped them to speed up their time to market with the delivery of new products by better metadata management use. IT failure. I have a database of more than 500 IT projects that I've done over the years, and every one of them has had a data point at the failure. In other words, the data is the root cause of the IT project failure. And the root cause of that is, quite simply, bad metadata management. I'll call out a very specific example here, one we've worked with on and off over the years. One of the armed forces is building a system that involves putting together 3 different pieces of ERPs. And each of these ERPs is the biggest ERP implementation they've ever done. So these 3 represent very, very large implementations. In order to do this, and they handed the 3 ERP implementations to 3 separate vendors. And the 3 separate vendors, well, let me ask you, what do you think the chance of these 3 vendors will have developed the same metadata about each of these systems? And the answer is absolutely none unless you force them to. And they weren't forced to, so consequently when you turn the systems on, they are finding out, they go, oh my goodness, you didn't tell you wanted this one to talk to that one. And the business users say, well, what else would we have done it for? But it turns out it wasn't in the specs. And so the Government Accountability Office roundly criticized the entire project, as well as the hundreds of millions of dollars of wasted taxpayer money, not to mention lack of support for our men and women of the armed forces. Last benefit, major benefit on this is, again, we're looking around and trying to identify rot data, data that is redundant, obsolete, or trivial. And without understanding metadata, of course, there is no way of doing all of this. Metadata is not strictly related to semi-structured. By the way, I really dislike the term unstructured data because the definition of data that is unstructured is data that can't be structured, data that has no structure. So the better way to describe it is semi-structured, and better still is to talk about tabular data and non-tabular data. But either way, metadata is going to be a concept that plays within here. Again, it's going to exist in a number of different formats, where we can look specifically at content management system. How many of you out there have a really messed up SharePoint site? Gee, I'm not surprised. I see everybody's hand raised, right? Again, just all kinds of different ways of collecting information in there. And when we get into more formalized means of this, we tend to call them taxonomies or ontologies, which gets us more into the smart data area, which is really, really good. For example, again, just describing descriptive metadata, the catalog information that we have, or the thesauri keyword terms that are in there. Some of you may have heard of some of these examples. The Dublin Core, for example, is the core set of data elements that we use to manage libraries. Librarians devised this system many, many years ago, and we've used it ever since. So nobody sits down and says, what are the basic elements that I need to describe a book? Okay. They've been known. It's really well described, although I will say there is never enough crosstalk between the library science people, the computer science people, and the data people that talk on all of these things. But you can extend this all the way out into thesauri keywords, XML schemas, again, all sorts of things which might result in an integration or an update schedule, or ways of deciding what does it mean to be a page. I know that sounds a little bit esoteric there, but if you change the size of a page from a different device, you're maybe using a phablet or a large cell phone, something like that, the pages will be different from them appearing on a large screen monitor. A couple of more specific pieces of metadata that you may run into, even if you don't have an effort in your organization to use this. You can buy existing reference models for your industry. Teradata sells a number of them. Oracle sells a number of them. The example I have in there is a retail data model that's in there. But somebody else may have developed a conceptual model a couple of years ago. And the nice thing is we all have cameras now, so the metadata repository capabilities now include the ability to snap a picture of a whiteboard and make sure that you can tag that with the right sets of components so that you can go out and get it. You may have to do some reverse engineering on your existing systems that are in there, and some of you may be working on components of enterprise data models and things. So these are a number of different things that can all add value to projects around metadata. Now, it's important here to talk a bit about history, and I'm not going to dwell on it, but we kind of made a bad series of prognostications collectively as an industry back in the 90s. Many of you will remember something called case tools. And case tools, while they are fun and actually have an awful lot to value, their usage is almost negligent in organizations these days. Very, very small numbers of organizations are formally using case tools in the way in which they were originally done. And the case tools, of course, manage metadata. But what we sort of said collectively as an industry was, give us a little while and we'll have everything taken care of. The problem was that management never really recognized the values of them. They sort of said, yeah, we can try it, but that goes back to Dave Eddy's comment at the beginning of this. Only 5% of the ones that actually started over the last 20 years seem to be out there. And that means it's a big, big problem, because then people say, oh, okay, so it was a waste of money. Now, another thing they say is a waste of money was Y2K, but the reason we had problems with Y2K was because we did poor metadata management. If we had had a list of where all of the date features in all of our programs were, maintenance, getting ready for the Y2K problem or challenge would have been much easier. But we didn't have that metadata, and consequently we had to go through and examine everything and look for them. That's, of course, why everybody says, oh my gosh, what a awful, awful exercise that was. I know a lot of people that quit IT because they just got sick of making piles and piles of money doing really dumb remediation in there. Now, here we are almost 20 years later, and people say Y2K was a waste of money. No, no. Bad things would have happened if we hadn't fixed the Y2K problems. However, it was not a good use of our money because it was a self-inflicted wound. It was an unnecessary expense that we all had to absorb in order to come up with this. Similarly, around data warehousing, you will see an awful lot of organizations building their first or second data warehouses, and they spend a lot of time having discussions about what is the authoritative source that should be put into the data warehouse, where it can then reside as a single source of truth for the organization. The problem is the methods that they use are often based on faulty or non-existent metadata, and consequently the wrong stuff is put in the warehouse, only to be discovered after the warehouse is put entirely in production. So when we look at this, what we're seeing now is a change in warehousing, where we say, no, let's not, in fact, put only one source of information in the data warehouse. Storage is cheap. Let's put all of the data in the data warehouse, but let's make sure that we tag it with the right metadata. By the way, there's a metadata standard out there called 11179, and that metadata standard will ensure that when we go in there to make the change and discover that we're in fact running the report from the wrong set of data, we just change the pointers on that data. And eventually we can cull the non-existent, the rot data out of that warehouse. That way, if you make a mistake, you don't have to go back and rebuild it. Instead, you do exactly the opposite of that. You point to a different data source within the data warehouse, because it's cheaper to do that than it is to absorb the cost of the mistakes that we absolutely know are being made over and over and over again. I mentioned, again, the sort of history here. I was on the Defense Department's project to develop a standard case tool use for the entire Department of Defense. And in the process, we were going to spend literally $1 billion and drop it on one case tool vendor. The Government Accountability Office, I mentioned them before, in conjunction with that military project I was talking to you about, They said that's not a good idea. If you drop $1 billion on any one vendor, then all the other vendors will lose. We said, yeah, that's probably good wisdom. So they made us divide up the $1 billion among several competing vendors. So we had a plethora of case tools that were used in the Defense Department, but they also put some money aside from it and said, also develop something called CDIF, Case Definition Interchange Facility, so that metadata in one case tool could be exchanged into metadata in another facility relatively easily. And that CDIF became eventually XML. Again, the idea of changing automatically from one format, one set of tags to another. So it was good research that was done. It wasn't ultimately immediately successful, but 10 years later, as XML came on board, it did prove to be very, very useful. I mentioned the Dublin Core. Again, this is 1995 here. ISO 11179 was evolved over the 1994 to 1999. People were they're building warehouses. The OMG group put together the Common Warehouse Meta Model in 1998. Again, we've had lots of these things that have been developed, and all of them have been good. It's all helpful as we start to move forward on all of this. We've then tried to evolve this into a more relevant series of practices. Excuse me, and unfortunately, the topic has only come recently back into the world when the Edward Snowden issue came out, because people unfortunately aren't taught this in school. We learn this collectively as IT professionals after we finish our school, for the most part, and through organizations such as Diane Dataversity that provide this kind of ongoing education for us. Absent these vehicles, it's very unclear how a lot of us would really get this information in play. But what most of us encounter now is when somebody like the president says, well, it's okay, you don't have to worry about the NSA spying on you. They're not actually collecting your data. They're just collecting your metadata. And the Electronic Frontier Foundation came up with what does that mean? Well, they know you rang a phone sex service from your metadata at 2:24 a.m. and spoke for 18 minutes. They don't have any idea what you talked about. They know you called a suicide prevention hotline from the middle of the Golden Gate Bridge, but the topic of that call remains a secret. They know you spoke to an HIV testing service and then your doctor and then your health insurance company in the same hour, but they don't know what you discussed. They know you received a call from your local NRA office while it was having a campaign against gun legislation, and you called your senators and congressional representatives immediately afterwards. But those calls don't know, or they know you spoke to a gynecologist for a half hour and then called the local Planned Parenthood number, but nobody knows what you talked about, right? Well, again, you can see how this metadata is absolutely key to putting context on things. Again, go back to my number 42. So let's talk a little bit about strategy. And the question is, what are you going to do in your organization about metadata? Now, there's a real interesting twist that we get to on this, which is that metadata really doesn't actually have a good objective definition. And you can't point to something and say, is that metadata? It turns out that one person's metadata is another person's data and vice versa. So it's a very difficult thing. Really, from a strategy perspective, what you really want to say is we want to have a way of differentiating between regular data and data that we need to keep information about in order to unlock its value. And that strategy should be driven by business objectives and prioritized by business value. So we're not going to try to collect all the metadata. What we really want to do is build a metadata strategy from a set of defined components. Now, it's very, very difficult to actually understand how difficult this process is unless you've been through it. And I know a number of you on the call have been through this, and maybe you'll share some stories as we get to the end in the Q&A session on this. But if you have a conversation with a metadata vendor, okay, a vendor that's selling you metadata management technologies, if the organizations are at the same level of maturity, that conversation can be extremely productive. However, most organizations, because they don't have the education, they've only read either some glib stuff that says you should manage all of your metadata in order to do best practices or something along those lines, is absolutely not a helpful conversation. So what we suggest is that it's a little bit like the idea that a kid comes to the family and says, I want a pet dog. And the family says, well, you know, having a dog is a living thing. It has some responsibilities. So rather than giving you a dog, we're going to give you this little electronic pet that they sell in Japan. And you have to take that pet outside every 3 hours or so, or it'll make a mess. And you have to feed it on a regular basis, or the thing will get sick and die. And these little electronic pets actually do that. You have to take them outside for a walk, and if it doesn't get walked, it makes a mess. And if you don't feed it on a regular basis, it dies. And, of course, the kid who thinks the dog is cute, if they end up with a dead, you know, pet, it sounds kind of harsh, but if they end up with a dead pet, the parents say, look, you're not ready for a live one. You would have had some problems there. Now, the analogy here is that most organizations aren't ready to have a conversation with the metadata vendors. And so what we'd advise you to do is to build your own metadata repository-like functionality. You can do it out of Access. You can do it out of Microsoft SQL Server. There are a number of very good tools that are out there. Even a good set of Oracle technologies will do it. You don't need to make it a complicated data set. What you need are a couple of ingredients. You need somebody who understands the ability to maintain this meta language, the higher existing, the beyond the standard framework that we've talked about already, and that you have a business owner that says, I want to have this information. I'll give you an example we did on one project in Europe that we were doing. They were building a new set of IT capabilities, and we pointed out to them that they had not a terrific understanding of the actual requirements on the project. So we used the metadata repository to track the number of changes to the requirements that were going on, and we plotted them over time. So you could see a plot that went up and down and eventually looked like it was leveling off. And we said, good, it looks like the requirements are stabilizing. And so people said, what does that mean? And we said, look, we can show you over time the number of changes that have been made to this are stabilizing. Ah, wow, that was an interesting piece. Well, they started to use this type of capability for a year or so, and actually got to be pretty proficient with it and decided they were ready to graduate to the next level. Had another group that we were working with, a different part of the world on this, but again, they were looking at a set of specific business practices, and the metadata described some aspects of that business practice. So they had a business executive that would come in and want reports that were run from this metadata repository. So they had this business customer that they were able to use. Now, my point here is that by doing these other exercises for a series of months or often a year in many cases, then you've had some experience at managing metadata, and now you're ready to have a conversation with the vendors. But don't go straight out and buy one, because the focus of this strategy is to get an issue, get an understanding, to understand what are the drivers around what should be your program as you're putting it all together. Because if you don't have an understanding of how your current environment meets this and what your future needs are going to be, you're going to be unable to buy something. Imagine sitting down and trying to buy an automobile at age 5. Again, you're thinking it's going to be, does it have a TV set in it, you know, or something like that. You're going to focus on the wrong requirements. So these strategic objectives that you develop as part of your metadata strategy are going to help define what will eventually become your enterprise metadata architecture and talk about logical steps. When the organization has reached stage 3, phase 3, maturity level 10, whatever it is that you're doing. And don't feel badly for not having this, because when we look around, we find that only 1 in 10 organizations even has a data strategy, much less a metadata strategy. So the nice part is, if you take a couple of years to learn how to do this right, you will still be one of the few organizations that is capable of doing this, and consequently still able to implement a sustained competitive advantage in order to do it. So what are we talking about in terms of implementation? Let's go through and do a strategy implementation and planning and say, what are the goals? Why will we benefit from better managed data, more value unlocked from our data by doing metadata management on these small amounts of data items? Let's talk to the specific stakeholders who are in fact involved in the process so that we can understand how they will need to have this data unlocked, and it will deliver value to them, and they will become champions of our method in order to support this. that they will then allow us to gain access and build out the information architecture that will allow us to start proving the concepts and lay the groundwork for a future architecture. And then we can start adding technology as it might make sense. So let's take a look at some specific building blocks around that area. Goals and principles. Always good to say what is happening. Let's get some very simple things, and let's integrate metadata from a number of different sources and provide easy access to those sources so that we can allow our various metadata users to quickly and easily understand how to derive value from it. Again, when we look at it in particular, one of the other elements of metadata is data quality. And while I mentioned before the provenance of much of your data might be unknown, it turns out also that likely in your organizations the quality of the data in many parts of your organizations is also of unknown quality. That can be a problem and a scary thing. Write it down on a piece of paper and say it at the appropriate meeting, and I guarantee you'll get somebody's attention. So the activities around this really do revolve around understanding your metadata requirements, moving those requirements around until they form an architecture in some way, shape, or form to get some form of standards and say for these data items. And by the way, a lot of good places to start on all this is with master data items because they will link to the transactions and have a leveraging effect in order to do this. So we're going to put some metadata standards in place that are only going to the scope of these standards are only going to be the master data items in there, and of course these metadata pieces are going to be completely clear. By the way, a quick piece of metadata around master data. I hope I don't confuse people on this. We've been listening to me babble here for 40 minutes or so and try this. But when you implement master data, one of the most important pieces of metadata is to build an objective definition of what master data is. Because if you can't articulate quickly and easily to anybody that asks you in your organization, what's the difference between master data and non-master data, you haven't a chance in hell of actually implementing master data well, because people will do things like, well, I couldn't figure out where to stick the data, so I just stuck it in the MDM. It happens all the time. We see it all over the place. Again, implementing a managed metadata environment and creating and maintaining the metadata are great first activities, but we urge you not to go spend $10 million on that first. Instead, build something, play with it for a bit, and then have a good conversation with the vendors, but don't go straight to the vendors. You're also going to have to know about how to integrate metadata, particularly if you're in an M&A situation where you're doing mergers and acquisitions. Again, the repository is something that eventually we see about half the organizations building their own, about half of them buying them. Once you have the metadata, of course, you don't want it to become a black hole, so it just goes in and nothing ever comes out. We also hear that called the Hotel California. Again, the point is if we have metadata but we can't deliver it when it's needed, it's kind of useless, right? And again, we want to report on our progress to be able to work through that. Now, there are metadata standards in addition to this. Many of them are industry or consensus standards, but a lot of them are also international standards. And this framework in particular shows you how the standards are related and how they can rely on each other for context and usage in there. I'll mention a couple of them here. Already said the common warehouse metadata. If you are warehousing, it makes good sense to take a look at this. These folks have updated this model 3 different times over the years. It's very, very useful and very appropriate. Another one is from OMG, the information meta model here, which talks about connecting things like your business process model, your technology components, the actual model management itself, and the ability of implementing common ontological definitions within this. So you can translate one model to another model in order to do this. Again, the deliverables that are going to come out of this particular process are going to be a metadata repository-like functionality. Okay, I say that very carefully because I don't want people to go off and just buy a repository, but you should be able to also demonstrate that the quality of your metadata is improving. And if you start out with the quality of all of our metadata is unknown and then say we're now moving to where some of it is known, that does represent an improvement. The ability to analyze your metadata and see what's actually happening, what the lineage of a specific item that you use to make a decision on. I was literally in a meeting this morning where we were looking at data, and somebody eventually said, well, we can't use this data at all because it's all crap. And the metadata didn't match what the data was. It would say things like, well, the first degree came from here, and the second degree, first degree was a master's degree, and the second degree was a bachelor's. And that just doesn't happen most of the time in order to do that. We also want to be able to do the forecasting of impact analysis. So if I'm going to replace this system with another system, we also want to control metadata and make sure we go through the proper versioning and configuration management procedures that need to happen on all of this. And of course, what we're trying to maintain are these models and architecture so that we can in fact do the operational analysis that is needed. There's a number of different roles that come in here. We have suppliers of metadata, metadata participants, metadata consumers that are able to use all of these things as we go back and forth in order to take a look at these things. Again, these are important for you to write down and just sort of put and sort of look at stakeholders from so that you can take a look at it. And again, I mentioned the technologies. You can build your own. There are all kinds of modeling tools out there. Database management systems allow you to reverse engineer this. Most of the case tools will allow you to reverse engineer. Most of the databases will give you access to the catalog. There's lots of integration, intelligence tools, system management tools. The real thing that we see here, again, object modeling, report, process writing. The real thing we see here is that people don't realize that they've got an awful lot of things out there already. They don't need to go off and reinvent the wheel, that you can use things that are either off the shelf or already commonly known within your existing environment to get started. After you've gotten started, then it makes sense to say, hey, we've been doing it this way for a while. Is there a more efficient way? One of the examples that I'll give you, we worked with one of the metadata management tool vendors, and they had something that required a lot of human interaction with their tool. And one of the companies that we work with said, this is a very inefficient use of the human beings in this process, so we're not going to buy your tool until you go through and automate, or at least semi-automate, this particular process. And they did, and it actually made a lot of difference. It was much better for everybody, and the vendor was quite pleased to get the guidance and had a better product as a result of that. So again, principles, look at a strategy, get commitment and funding if you can, in the sense that you're saving money. Remember, metadata unlocks the value of data. Quantify that value and be able to show it to people. This is how we make our living on this. Make sure that you take an enterprise perspective on all of this. Make sure that you have this strategy that you can put in place, that you adopt appropriate standards after you evaluate a bunch of them, and that you have a decent process for adding tags to your data that comes in. This is even more important as we look at big data technologies, because they can do this tagging at a much faster rate than we've been able to do as well. I have one organization that I work with that has a terrific metadata management practice, and their intake is wonderful, but they have exactly one user of their process. And that is going to be a problem for them at some point, because I guarantee you she will hit the lottery sooner or later. Right, Sandy? Anyway, understand and articulate the necessity of the metadata. Measure your content and usage. Leverage XML. I've got another whole talk we could do on XML and metadata. That's a different hour that we'd spend on that. Make sure that the business understands what you're doing in this, and then put in places to make sure that people implement policy correctly as a part of data governance. Remember, the language of data governance is metadata in order to do this. And finally, certify the quality on all of this. Now, I promised you an example, a teachable example, and this is really key to this. Almost everybody is familiar with iTunes. This is an old version of the iTunes interface, but it nevertheless is still pretty much the same product. And interestingly enough, when you stuck a CD into your iTunes, the CD would look like this for a little bit of time. Wow. Okay, what have I got there? Well, iTunes can count the number of tracks, 25 of them. It can determine the length of each track, 2 minutes and 34 seconds for the first track, 4 minutes and 23 seconds for the 25th track. But all of a sudden, it turns into, oh, something else. What's happening? every piece of CD that is cataloged through something called the Gracenote Media Database. Great company, we're all thankful for them. It sends a little bit of code out there and says, I think I've got this, and it comes back and says, the first song is Move, right? The second name of the CD is Complete Birth of the Cool. The artist is Miles Davis. The track names are all there, the genre, the artwork. It sure would be a pain to type all of this information into each of your iTunes pieces, correct? So you have a very, very big boost that we get. Again, the data that comes in is all that wonderful music that we'd like to have, but without the metadata, we are unable to, in fact, effectively add value to it. What can I do once I have this metadata? I can add it to something called a smart playlist. So I start typing in, I make a smart playlist, and I type in Miles Davis, and it goes through and says, hey, guess what? You had another Miles Davis library out there. Notice I have the Complete Birth of the Cool, but also Live at the Fillmore East. So it found some data out there that I didn't even know that I was going to be able to use as I was doing this. And when I do that, it means I'm gaining value from my metadata. I can now put together a playlist of just Miles Davis, so when I feel like listening to Miles at night, it's interesting. So I didn't get the desired results. I actually got more than the desired results because I had this other tune, and I need to fine-tune it. So now I want to add into it the metadata rule. It says only want to have a song list that contains the album Complete Birth of the Cool, or I can keep the all Miles Davis layer. And in fact, iTunes lets you do any of that. None of it would be possible at all without metadata. And if we take this now to the next level, the same interface, the same processing, the same data structures, the same code can now be applied to podcasts, movies, books, and other things, PDF files, in order to manage all of this stuff, which is, A, why iTunes is such a mess, because we're trying to manage a whole lot with it. But those of us that are good iTunes people, kind of get this and do a pretty good job, and other people who are new to it, it's a little bit tough. But do you get the scale, the economies of scale that happen here as a result of doing this? So again, just a quick little example there of how to show somebody what metadata is. Say, give me a CD, push that CD into the computer, and then try to actually have the information described when you're not connected to the internet, and all you'll get is track 1 through track whatever. But if you're able to access the Gracenotes database, one authoritative source of master data management for audio recordings, they'll be able to give you that information back with you. So again, our takeaways: metadata unlocks the value of data and therefore requires management attention, requires specialized team skills to engineer, store, and deliver the metadata. And doesn't this look an awful lot like I just showed you a little bit what data management was? Yes, because metadata is data. And that becomes a little bit problematic because a lot of people say, well, what's the difference? Here's the difference. Are you going to look at something and not decide, is it metadata or is it not metadata? What you should do instead is look at metadata and say, are we going to extend the scope of our metadata management practices to include this data item? And now you are asking the right question, because now you can say, I will only extend and include this data item in my metadata practices if it adds value. If your data governance team is running around in circles and talking about things, it's because they're not focusing and using the right language, which correctly is metadata. And this defines the essence of any specific data integration challenge that we face along the way. So we're back at the top of the hour here, and I will look forward to your questions and answers, and hopefully you're getting the idea of what metadata management strategies are relative to everything else. I've included a couple of references in here for you so that you can look up and see some of the good books that are on those areas in terms of metadata management as a freebie. And we'll switch it back over to Britt and talk about what sort of questions you all have.
Yeah, I just kind of went through it. It's now time for everyone to ask their questions. Make sure you click on the Q&A window feature at the top of your screen, and you should be able to submit your questions through that window. I was able to pull down 2 questions as we went through it that were assigned to me, or a couple actually, 3. Let me start with the first one that came on in through the pipeline. I've also checked the Twitter sphere, and I don't see any #DataEd ones out there. You could also submit your Q&As that way. The first one is, Peter, in your experience, where is metadata lacking the most, both in terms of organization type and data type? For example, business versus universities, finance versus HR data.
Gosh, I think the simple answer to that question is everywhere, but let me give you a couple of examples. In a university context, it's a very great place to start. One of the things universities are asked to do is to make reports on things. The president of our university and most universities gets questions on a regular basis where people say, how many of these do you have? How many of those? What, for example, a popular question today is, what's the graduation rate? Then you have to go back and say, what do you mean by graduation rate? And it turns out, interestingly enough, many of you probably aren't aware of this, most colleges and universities measure a 5-year graduation rate rather than a 4-year graduation rate. Whoa, that's an interesting piece of metadata in and of itself, isn't it? In other words, as parents, most people are sitting around planning on 4 years of tuition. It's expensive enough as it is, but when you realize that you actually have 5 years that most people take to graduate, wow. So they throw the term graduation rate around a lot. Most people don't realize that most graduation rates are measured in 5 years rather than in 4 years. Now, my point here is that it's very easy to make a case for metadata strategies in a university environment because people write the same report. Somebody else will say, what are you working on? Oh, I'm doing a report on graduation rates. Oh, really? I did one of those last week. And they won't realize that they have actually duplicated work back and forth in order to go through that. So very, very difficult process to understand what all the various questions that are being asked of a university, but you better believe most universities are asked a bunch of questions. So in a university context, it's very, very easy to make a case for metadata strategies and saying, you know, gosh, we really should make this as efficient as possible. If I pull this out, what really most people end up realizing is that pulling the data out is good, but if we actually make an information system where people who are interested can simply get online themselves and answer their own questions, it's actually a whole lot easier than it is to go in and answer the same question over and over and over again. But let's take the commercial sector again as well. One of the things that you'll see organizations do is work on compliance types of issues. So maybe they're selling goods that are regulated, for example, by the government. They may be, maybe hazardous chemicals or something like that, and they have to make sure that the hazardous chemicals are handled properly to go through. Well, if you don't tag those chemicals with special metadata tags so that anybody in the organization has visibility into them and to understand which shipments they're on and which parts of the stores they're stored in, then the store may end up with a fine. And that fine results in tangible dollar losses. So it becomes relatively easy to go back and say, hey, here you go. We spent last year $30,000 in fines and another $100,000 in legal fees. If we could solve that problem and reduce the number of fines, by a tangible amount of money, that would actually be a pretty easy business case to make. And in fact, we've made it for a number of organizations. I'll give you one more example, though, before we go to the next question, Britt, and that was that on Friday night I was with my parents setting up a new computer for my dad. His eyesight isn't as good, and his 12-inch MacBook Pro isn't quite as useful to him, so we got him a 27-inch iMac. Oh, boy, is he loving it. And he said, well, I really want to use the iPhoto service. To when I take a picture with my iPhone, it goes up to the cloud automatically and comes down on my computer, and I don't have to load the stuff back and forth. He's 83 years old. He gets this, right? And I said, well, Dad, yeah, you have an interesting problem here. You only have 5 gigabytes of free storage that Apple's giving you, and you have 17 gigabytes of pictures. Now, many of your pictures are duplicated. You could spend some time sitting down and duplicate and deduplicate all those pictures, get rid of all that data rot, as we called it. He said, yeah, I could do that, but that would take a long time. so how much is Apple going to charge me to upgrade my storage? And it turns out Apple only charges you 99 cents a month to go from 5 gigabytes of storage to 50 gigabytes of storage. And he said, wow, that's a really interesting example of data management. I find it a lot easier to pay Apple $1 a month for me to badly manage my pictures so I don't have to go through and sort them, but I can get all the functionality that I want out of that really easily. I thought that was a great example, and I was like, yes, Dad, okay, that's good.
I pay that 99 cents a month as well. So
hey, and I'll bet a bunch of people do out there, Brett, absolutely. So many of us think that's convenience, right? Absolutely. But it's also pretty tangible, pretty easy to put a dollar value on it. Anyway, I babbled on that. Is that a good answer for it?
Yeah, I think you hit the intent of that question there. The next question that kind of popped up is, I'm not exactly sure about the phraseology of it. You might be able to hit it a little bit better, but what would be a good use case to bring out differences between data dictionary and metadata?
Great question. All right, so one of my favorite companies that really used a data dictionary very well is Nokia. I worked for them for a number of years and had some tremendous success working with their folks. Nokia is a culture of engineers. They are a wonderful company that really, really understands engineering as a hardcore science. And they also are a company that committed themselves to working in English. So even though I would go to Helsinki and work with them, actually Espoo, Finland, hey to all the Finns out there, right? They actually were very kind and didn't make me learn Finnish. They instead learned English, and it's supposed to be the language of the company. Now, I say this as prelude because another thing that they absolutely internalized, that they inculcated, that they took on as a really deep, meaningful piece of what they did at Nokia was that anytime they encountered a term that was unfamiliar to them, they would immediately turn to the nearest computing device, whether it was a tablet, an iPhone, excuse me, it was a Nokia phone, computer terminal, and they would look up that term in the Nokia term bank. Now, everybody in the company knew what the Nokia term bank was and how it was supposed to be used. When you didn't understand a term or you had a term that was confusing, you looked it up. And it was that behavior. It was automatic. It was programmed into them. It was part of their DNA. It was the way they operated. And, of course, they would occasionally find terms that were not in the term bank. And they would look and say, oh, here's a term. Should it be in the term bank? And they had a process where you filled out a little quick web form, and it went into a queue, and a group of engineers would sit down on Friday afternoons, usually with some libations, and sit down and say, should these terms be in the term bank? And if so, how should we describe them? So a terrific, terrific example of how to put the data dictionary in place. Now, the question was, what's the difference between that and metadata? Well, the term bank unlocked the value of data. So when we used a term at Nokia that was unfamiliar to some of the people in the room, they were able to look up in the term bank, and if it was in there, they would know that this term meant this from a corporate perspective. So they would use that term. That is a sub-portion of metadata management. It is absolutely using the metadata, the data about the data, to describe a bit of a formal definition on it. But there are many other uses of metadata, and one of the exercises I described to you earlier of using metadata in a build-your-own context so that you could get smart and then, in fact, implement that was done there as well. And the architects practiced for about a year, learned about it, and then felt competent to go and have a conversation with a vendor, and then implemented a larger, more comprehensive metadata repository where they started to store things such as code, models, other things that were beyond the scope of the Nokia term bank. But again, a terrific little exercise there. I don't think much has been written about the Nokia term bank, and it was just a delightful exercise of being able to show people how to use it from both a technical and, of course, a non-technical aspect of it as well.
Very cool. All right. I think, yeah, I mean, you definitely hit on that one. The next question was, at present, I am creating and maintaining metadata on key data sets that my institution reports to government. I store these on the institutional wiki. What other ways would you suggest I store these?
Well, that goes back to your strategy. If you're storing them in a way that you're reporting them up to entities, and it sounds like it's a mandated reporting component, it may be useful to look at taking some of that wiki data and eventually maturing it to the point where it would become useful to store it in some sort of a lookup facility. Now, many people are using wikis to manage their metadata because it's a very effective terminology. Nokia's example was not done in wiki because they sort of saw things a little bit more structured, a little bit more precise, and so they didn't want to have a lot of people describing this. But you can crowdsource some of your metadata pieces. This is a true story. We actually had a fellow who we were working with at one of the places, I think it was in New York. Lewis and I were doing some work there at one point, and this fellow came back from lunch and said, okay, here is a napkin. I did some calculations on the back of a napkin at lunchtime, and you're always talking about metadata, so show me how you're going to maintain this metadata for us. It was an interesting challenge. So what we did is we tagged the napkin. We took a picture of it. It was a fellow named Richard. And we tagged the napkin with tax calculations for country X, country Y companies. You know, again, it was a number of things he'd worked out over lunch. Clearly a dedicated individual in this case. And then we put it in the metadata facility. And what happened when we put it in the metadata facility, this word got around, and we looked then at the end of the year and saw that the most frequently accessed piece of metadata was, in fact, Richard's napkin. Now, that was just because of the notoriety, but it still was easy for people to grab that, and most importantly, it showed people how easy it was to put metadata in there. They would now start taking pictures of the whiteboards where they do drawings, brainstorming sessions, et cetera, and be able to put this information in. So they'd have I'm looking for a brainstorming session. Which one? Well, it was done in August. Well, there's 3 in August. Oh, good. Well, it's certainly one of those 3, and they would grab the right one and be able to go right back to the discussion they were having back in August. So it's fairly easy to start maturing these things. Now, when I say that in a wiki sense, what happens in many organizations is they like to use social media to enhance the discussion around it. So we might put a term out there. We might ask a group of, 10 or 15 or even everybody in the organization to comment on an organization-wide definition for that term. That's a great place to start. But when you get to the point where it's done and we've actually agreed on that definition, then probably you want to take it out of the wiki because you don't want people looking at all the baggage of how did I get to this term. Instead, what you really want to do is to say, now these are more formal terms, so we're now going to have them in a dictionary sense where we can look it up, present the information, describe it accordingly in order to do that. So that's how I would look at that, is to say the wiki is good for developing the metadata, for getting the understanding, for achieving consensus, and for doing things like crowdsourcing, but that the next step is probably to formalize this and say, okay, great, we've talked about that for a while. Now we're going to make a decision, and here's the decision we, in fact, have made.
Very cool. One of the users, kind of to hit on some of the things that you just broached with your response there, asked the question, how do you effectively manage the currency of metadata, i.e. the metadata is up to date and current?
Again, it is data just like all other kinds of data. So you want to manage your metadata with good data management practices, which means governance has to be applied to it. It doesn't mean that you need to go through and inspect each data item, but it's fairly easy to put processes in place to say what are the important metadata items driven by our organizational metadata strategy. And for those data items, how often should they be checked? Are there update frequencies? Are there characteristics of this data that would make it less valuable? And we should put those into a risk mitigation plan. So again, great question on how one actually keeps this stuff current, because it's not the Hotel California. You don't want to check in and never have this stuff checked back out again. If you do that, it's going to be seen as a science project. You most definitely don't want people to think your metadata activities are science projects. You want them to be seen as having excellent business value.
Very cool. Okay, I will go ahead and ask you this question. I think might be your favorite one of the whole thing, is if you could read just one book on metadata management, what book should that be?
Wow. On metadata management, Adrienne Tenenbaum wrote a terrific book. I'm pretty sure it's in the references there a couple of years ago, where she was describing really how to use metadata in there. Let me just see if I've got it listed. Yeah, Metadata Solutions. That's an excellent book that she has. Her previous book to that one, that was in 2001. Her previous book to that one was 94, which was Corporate Repository. I will say another one on how to understand metadata in practice is the Diane Hellman book that's on this particular screen. On this. But actually, the reason we gave you these books in here is because all of them have some very, very good information in them. So I'd hate to say if you had to read just one, but I would definitely start with Adrienne's book. I think it's very well written.
Okay, very cool. One more question just popped up, and it's what are your views of having data lineage in metadata?
Oh, absolutely. Lineage metadata is some of the most crucial data for some organizations. I'll give you a big one that most people may know about at this point. Much of our misinformation on the Iraq weapons of mass destruction came from a source called Curveball. You can look it up on the internet. That was the source's code name. Curveball turned out to be a fabricator of information, and largely on Curveball's bad information, we ended up invading Iraq. Now, let me give you a little bit more on the lineage piece. So, in other words, somebody said they have weapons of mass destruction. This is some of the information that was fed to Secretary of State Colin Powell when he made his presentation for the United Nations. And he said they have these trucks, these things, and Curveball was the identity where they were from. If Colin Powell said if he had known they were coming, that information was coming from Curveball, he knew that Curveball was an unreliable source, and he would never have made the presentation using the words that he did in that particular United Nations session. But let's take another example of the same kind of thing. The vice president at the time, Dick Cheney, would call a reporter for the New York Times named Judith Miller and tell her Iraqi has weapons of mass destruction. I'm oversimplifying here, but you get the picture. He would tell her this. She would then write a story that said Iraq has weapons of mass destruction, and President Cheney would say, look, the New York Times is reporting that the Iraqis have weapons of mass destruction. How can we not go in and report this? So the lineage is absolutely crucial for some types of applications. Now, the question of how you implement that can be a very interesting process. Some organizations do lots of tricks to automate the process of adding lineage metadata to their managed metadata. Others really do have to have more of a manual curation process, and that goes back to my comment about making sure that the library scientists are involved in this. Don't reinvent the wheel. We've got years and years of history on this, so it's very important to make sure that people understand we don't have to start off each one of these from the absolute ground zero on this. Let me give you one more example on this, Brett, that's probably an important one for everybody to take home. And again, it goes back to we're maintaining this metadata through a value proposition. And let me give you a negative example that came out of my time in the Defense Department. I was asked to decide which of the 37 payroll systems that the Defense Department had at the time was the one that was going to be kept, because we clearly needed one instead of 37. 37 meant we had redundancies, et cetera, et cetera. So we actually used metadata to decide which system to keep. And the way we did it was that we went through and we did, actually before my time, they had done a process map of each of the 37 payroll systems, and quite frankly, between all of us, the process maps were uninteresting. They weren't bad, they were simply not informative to what we were trying to do. When we did data maps of all the systems, though, we were able to look and see what happened. In other words, the system in Pensacola, which was the system we ended up selecting for non-extinction, the system that was selected, that system was had categories in it, of metadata categories that we were able to support. The one I remember in particular was one-legged engineers working in waist-deep water underneath rotating helicopter blades on overtime. And when they called from the system in Colorado and said, why didn't you pick our system, I could look up in this little table we had built of metadata and say, well, you don't have the under-rotating helicopter blades requirement met. And they'd go, oh, yeah, you're right. And when the system in Columbus, Ohio would call up and say, why didn't you pick us? We'd say, well, you don't have one-legged engineers. And they'd go, oh, yeah, you're right. So we kept the harmony in this case by coming up with a fact-based analysis that was, in fact, based on the metadata of each of the systems in order to do this. Now, I tell this story because this solved an enormous problem that we had in the Defense Department. And the problem was this. DoD corporate couldn't really manage the DoD entities that were out there, the Army, the Navy, the Air Force, Marines, and the alphabet soup of all the agencies that were supporting the Defense Department. Because when DoD corporate would ask a question, like how many employees do you have in New Orleans, the people in New Orleans would come back and say, what do you mean by an employee? Which sounds like a silly question, and most people kind of get a chuckle about that. But really, it actually is a very important question because for most of our men and women of the armed forces at the time, they weren't making enough money to send their kids through college. So somebody who's working for low wages in the Army might take a part-time job in the Navy and work a couple of hours extra a week to start building up a college fund for their kids. Now, the question was, legitimately, does that count as one employee, or 2 employees, or 1.5 employees? And if you didn't have the answer to that, you couldn't possibly report back the right information. On the other hand, the entities all knew that as long as they were arguing about the metadata, they never actually got to the numbers, which meant DoD could never tell them that's too many or that's too few. In other words, DoD couldn't actually manage its own internal processes. It was a fascinating exercise to see the implications of this metadata management process not existing well within the Defense Department and actually hurting our ability to implement the missions that they had out there. So it was a very easy place, and it obviously made a difference with me where I could go in and say, hey, if you don't manage this well, you're going to be arguing about the definition of what is an employee instead of arguing about whether you have too many or too few, which is really what we should be arguing about, because we want to make sure the warfighters get the correct amount of resources and that we don't waste government resources in that context. So I'm giving you a bunch of different things here. Do we have any more questions, Brett?
Yeah, no, there's.
Oh, good. We'll keep going then.
They just flooded in, yeah. The next question is, I have 3 more so far, and there might be maybe 1 or 2 more that will flood in.
We'll go. Shannon doesn't kick us out.
Right. The next one is, can an MDM project be started/ran in parallel with the metadata project?
I would argue that if you don't, you have much risk to the MDM project and to the metadata piece. So, yeah, not only can they, but they should be. Again, our mantra around MDM is don't try and implement it unless you simultaneously stand. Let's think of MDM as a technology, as a very good, proven technology. It has lots of benefits, but it's only a technology. In order to make it architecturally sound, you need to enhance the technology with people and processes to give it a 3-legged stool. The other 2 legs on that are going to be metadata and governance. Probably some people would argue quality is an important aspect in there, so maybe you have a 4-legged stool instead of a 3-legged stool, but absolutely, very easy answer. If you try to do it without, and again, I gave you a little spiel about if you can't define what what master data management is for your organization, you have very little hope of actually distinguishing the value proposition from that.
Okay, very, very cool. The next question is, do you know any analysis/survey of how many data dictionaries are fostered in an average corporation? So, for example, hidden in SharePoint, manuals, file tools, etc.
No, I know no survey. I can tell you one organization that we worked with, we had to develop a list of the 400,000 production access databases that existed around the organization that the organization wanted to replace with well-managed IT assets. I can tell you that most work groups have some form of a data dictionary, informally or formally. Oftentimes it's a person, Dave, who you go to get the information from that in there. But no, I know of no survey that's doing that. However, it's a great question because one of the research projects we're working on at DAMA and with other groups is, in fact, how do you start inventorying these things? And metadata practices are, in fact, one of the things we're inventorying. So actually ask us this time next year, and we may have some results.
Very cool. The next question I have, and I think this is the last one on my list so far, I don't see any new ones popping up, is what tools exist today that help capture and present metadata?
Well, metadata is data. So any tools that you have that allow you to capture and present data can be used to enhance your metadata management practices and reinforce your metadata management strategies. Again, case tools are going to do this. One of the things people forget about Oracle systems, for example, Oracle has a very easy way of reading the Oracle catalog, which is where Oracle stores all its metadata. It's a wonderful resource. They do a terrific job with that. And once you understand that little trick, managing Oracle metadata becomes much easier. Okay, never easy, but at least easier in order to do this. So virtually anything that helps you manage your data is something that you can use to help manage better your metadata. And again, that's probably a great note for us to close on, which is the idea that metadata is data. We know how to manage data. Let's apply those practices to some subset of the data that adds specific value to specific data components so that we can now enhance and do better, unlocking the value of the data that we already manage around that.
Right, yeah. Definitely agree with that. Okay, I'll go ahead and close it out because I don't see any new ones coming through the pipeline. Thank you, Peter, for giving this great presentation, and thanks everyone for participating in today's event. And also thank you to Dataversity and Shannon for hosting us. Once again, you will receive today's materials within the next 2 business days. Our webinar next month will be Data Warehouse Strategies on December 8th. Hopefully you will be able to join us for that as well. As always, feel free to contact us if you have any additional questions. And thanks, everyone, and have a really awesome day.
Thank you, Britt, and thank you, Peter. Congratulations, Britt, on your first produced webinar with us. That's awesome. And thanks to our attendees, as always, for being so engaged in everything that we do. We really appreciate the questions coming in. As Britt mentioned, we'll get that follow-up email out within 2 business days, so by end of day Thursday with those links. I hope everyone has a great day.
Thanks, everybody.
Yeah.